it's not all at once. It's like 1 second delay. You see?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a
Well, because your computer's really slow right now.
well.
No, but like it's literally, it's not slow. It's just happening that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
To autologically represent the theory itself, the thing that we're going to probably talk about, this just sort of happened by the circumstances of things. And I decided to press record now rather than later because this is kind of interesting. So let's see. I also don't know quite how to make it stop yet. So
you just
imagine if I stop.
No, you don't want to. No.
No, I stopped screen sharing.
Oh, okay.
I believe we're still broadcasting as we ought.
Yeah, we're still broadcasting. But you'll want to turn that back on if we want to watch the video.
Indeed, yeah. So you want to watch a video, yes? All right.
Yeah. I mean,
you want to introduce this? Because do you want to introduce this to the audience? Because I don't even know what's going on yet.
Well,
so
this is
if you were to
video called "The Physics of Miracles." I mean, I guess the video is going to introduce itself as we get going, but it kind of tries to establish like a paradigm where we could understand, miracles and phenomena that we understand as supernatural in a kind of scientific sense, based on the framework that, obviously Johannan is an idealist, so it'll be on that kind of framework. So, yeah.
All right, so when I try to screen share, invariably I get this recursion factor, which
if you
eerily
just cover the
represents
Hangout screen with that, then that'll stop happening.
Yeah, I bet that what's there is good enough to see, especially if maybe I do as you said.
Yeah, I mean.
All right, so let's let's do that. So all the things are coming together. Let's proceed, and I'll listen to your questions as we go. You tell me when to stop, just by saying you have a question or you want a comment on something. I haven't seen this yet, so I don't know what we're in for. Recaption here. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I would make a possible statement. Any coherent epistemology has metaphysical consequences, interpersonal, metaphysical, factual consequences that are also indistinguishable from magic. And in a way, you could call that technology, depending on how far you want to stretch your terms. So I'll press play now. It seems to have,
it's buffering.
Stumbled upon itself. Yeah. Although it's well buffered past this point, I don't know why it's stuck.
Yeah, I guess, like, it is a little weird how that happens sometimes.
Well, it's also common, interestingly enough, and worthy of attempts at explanation for sure, common when certain interpersonal metaphysical forms are exemplified and certain modes of expression, certain truths in those forms discussed. You notice a lot of atypical electronic phenomena typically. And this happens very, very reliably. And I'm not entirely sure of all the causal factors, but I have some ideas at least. I'm going to refresh the screen and see if we can get another shot.
With 25 million bookable rooms and hotels.
Outlook, not so good. One more shot. This is not a bandwidth issue. We have, notice here where my cursor is, we have an ad. The reason for the pause is entirely unclear to me at this point, other than what I just mentioned about electronic oddities. Let's try one more time.
Chapter 1. Prologue. Contained within religions all over the world are tales of miraculous events, be they from the Abrahamic religions of the West or the Eastern religions of India. In religion, similar events are sometimes reported to occur and are chalked up to be paranormal. Whatever their origins, all of these accounts share one thing in common: upon the physical world in a manner that appears to transcend the laws of nature. As such, skeptics assert they are forbidden by science and are thus impossible.
A miracle is defined not as a part of the natural order, but as a suspension of the natural
No,
order. If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely? That the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake.
But is this really the case? Or are there more things on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in the materialistic philosophy of the skeptic?
I'd say things are different now.
Chapter 2. Signs and Wonders. When looked at carefully, the supposed impossibility of miracles arises more from a philosophical than a scientific disagreement. With the rise of dualism in the 17th century, a strict dichotomy arose between the natural material world and the mental, which was relegated to the supernatural. However, this produced two problems. Firstly, the supernatural was supposed to be off limits to the material sciences and inexplicable through human reason. This gave rise to the notion of the God of the Gaps, the idea that the supernatural was only ever needed to explain things that were currently unexplained by science. Secondly, how could the supernatural interact with the natural? If matter and mind were to interact, they would need to do so by some shared property. And if they shared a property, this dualism would collapse into monism. Thus, for dualism to work, the supernatural could never act upon the natural, and thus miracles possible. Being monistic in nature, this avoids the interaction problem of dualism. Furthermore, on idealism, the distinction between natural and supernatural fades, thereby placing a hair-raising possibility on the table. Can we explain miracles with science?
So something that kind of comes to mind
Chapter 3. Test hypothesis.
Pause.
It may be useful.
Yeah, something that comes to mind is that obviously, like, the church often uses the language, of natural versus supernatural in certain contexts, at least. I haven't quite done like that deep a dive into like exactly what that commits us to, like as Catholics. Does that commit us to a kind of dualism? I wouldn't think so, but because supernatural, one context that I think it's used in is like, supernatural grace or something like. we can't save ourselves naturally or like by our own efforts, but God has to kind of come in and do the atonement and obviously intervene in our own lives in order for us to be saved.
Yes.
So that might be it, but it might not be it, depending on how those terms are used.
Supernatural in the Catholic use, or the right and informed Catholic use of the term, refers to the nature and action and being of God only. Other things that would typically in our popular culture or in basically all science same category separation. Rather, it would refer to anything above the immediate, well, you can't really define it well. There's a lot of controversy. Natural order, whatever that means. Typically, heuristically, it would refer to things like angels, ghosts, paranormal phenomena of various kinds, clairvoyant abilities, things like that. That would be sort of broadly lumped into a category supernatural, a distinction that
There were
I
also
would
preternatural gifts, right?
Yeah. So above the, what we would understand as the material order as such, left to its own devices, again, kind of an incoherent concept because you can't have a situation logically possibly without the being of God. So really these terms do blur. And being of God, preternatural, angels, demons, things like that, pure spirits, and certain abilities of human beings that would be otherwise supernaturally or preternaturally infused or aided. Otherwise, everything else, the stuff of things, the little balls that roll around that we may call atoms, and then one day realize they're not little balls or whatever, as science progresses, who knows what it'll be. Then that's what we call natural in typical pop culture. And it's not exactly a coherent set of distinctions, if you ask me. There could be a better way to cleave the two. I'm not exactly settled on a way yet, but if you ask me to speculate, I could. But I'm not sure that's where you want to go.
Okay.
With the premise that miracles are either violations of the laws of nature or even bendings of them, but are exemplifications of the laws of nature when they are not inputted to, also understandable as interfered with or complicated by interpersonal relational disorder, which has a metaphysical effect and therefore a physical consequence. On my view, when said relational disorder is removed from the equation, the facts function differently, you may say, as they ought to, as they naturally by the nature of things left to be as themselves, as they logically are, would. And that's what we would call, or at least I would call, what we would call miracles. Order. And in a nutshell, the right functioning of things is a direct coherence and correspondence between a person's intentionality, their inner state, and the external facts, all extensionality. There is a energy, synchronicity, coherence, coherence. We are here together. We cohere without negation. There is that kind of result, and that has, well, it looks like what you'd call magic, and I guess it is functionally input-output wise that, but it's indeed very different from what, say, someone who would be inclined towards, occult practice in a way that would be questionable would be entering into. That would be a sort of manipulation interior desires or agenda. Whereas what I'm talking about is where there is a perichoresis, a direct reciprocity of infusion between one's desires and intentionality interiorly, the inner space, and the facts exteriorly, all extensionality, all other facts as they stand, minus the one referred to previously as the inner space. The correspondence and informational circumcision or perichoresis mean the same thing. Mutual definition and informing, which is actually a logical structure that can be proven very simply to obtain between any set, any referent, anything, and its broad complement. There's a circumcision of definition and what it is informationally that's convertible. One set is convertible to the other, and one implies the other. It's a biconditional.
Cut out just then.
Implication is kind of a theory of everything, informationally, logically, metaphysically, because it has to be. It's a minimalist reduction to most basic terms of certain things, and there are some implications that follow from this formula, as it were, big ones for both practical metaphysics and most theoretics and most disciplines, possibly all, just stuff I haven't thought of yet, that we know of. And it has to be that way because the theorem is itself so basic, and all the other facts or inquiry matters or bodies of knowledge are posterior epistemically to basic logic and math. In other words, the facts at the bottom are re-exemplified in the all other facts that are based on those, and you can't have something at variance with that substratum. Metaphysical core would be so effective at effecting a paradigm shift on everything else that wasn't already built on that. It would have to. And so what I've found is the system that's at hand for being discussed, which I've only publicly exposed in bits and pieces as I was in the process of coming to find it out. The system is both a matter of logical necessity, and it's provably so in terms of very simple arguments, and the structure and some fantastical conclusions, theorems from the core axioms, fantastical stuff, the real magic stuff, as it were, is not only a theoretical conclusion or byproduct, but it is an empiric is accessible to science and other eyes. So we're pretty much like me, Sarah, and Luke, and some of the people who have hung out with us over the last year or so have seen this set of phenomena that follows from the theory and the metaphysics that it describes and the practical leveraging thereof. They've seen this in action, and it, in fact, looks like supernatural knowledge, power. It looks like real magic. It looks like a trick, in fact, but it's a trick that is orchestrated not by a person, but by the confluence of all facts, such that synchronicities, Carl Jung type synchronicities, happen in an uninterrupted series in one's personal experience, which can be shared by all others in the room. A parade of synchronicities, one after another. Anything that anybody happens to say or think is exemplified, confirmed, reflected, essentially magically and dauntingly so by the exterior facts, whatever they are, through everybody around, regardless of whether or not they know what they're doing or saying, or the significance that it has to those listeners who are privy to perceiving the stream going on. Perception of streams of this sort, which I've called autology streams, is a function of the logic of the formula being applied to one's epistemic method interiorly, or how one faces the facts of the world. And via that principled approach, which results in a coherent epistemic stance in oneself, that coherent stance in oneself is, as a function of what can be proven from the theory, because according to what I began to describe earlier, the set theory thing, one set implies its broad complement, and its broad complement implies it informationally, perichoretically, and that fact obtains between one's interior state and the facts as they stand broadly by a matter of logical necessity. The thing that's in the way of that is a relational form disorder that affects our epistemic stance, such that we have an incoherent stance, and therefore there is a sort of disjunct relationship between interior and exterior. Therefore, we don't see the synchronicities. Therefore, we don't see the normal working of things unobstructed, which is, when seen, something. I don't want to say this. It's basically animism. In other words, everything is speaking, and it's speaking.
Did you say animism?
Yeah.
It's not that.
Like animism is a misnomer, because it would seem to imply a negation of scientific mechanism as we know it. But there's something to animism, and I bet the people who are into that may have been somewhat exposed to what we're finding here through our research, that there is a significance, a relevantism, a logically, situationally necessary communication from what is the case to each and every agent intentionality, every person, on the meaning terms and language game frame of that person all the time, in ways that are shocking and what would be considered non-natural, even though in fact it is natural once we properly understand and expand the definition of what nature means, that this is actually being in a scripted movie from a writer who has an infinite sense of irony, humor, perfect depth, and everything being totally germane and maximally meaningful and impactful continually. such that there's no redundancy, no lack, and it's as if it's a rig beyond any possible greatest conceivable rig I could ever imagine. And I genuinely don't know how some of this can be, some of the things that we've experienced literally, physically, that would qualify hands down as ridiculous violations of either what we'd call physical law or something like that, such that there have been perceptual omissions among human beings that have taken almost the status not having these perceptual restrictions seems to induce an experience where it seems that physical law is altered. I don't know. I'm having difficulty explaining some of the experiences that we've had. Yeah, please.
Maybe watching the rest would, maybe it would help.
Cool. Okay, so that's what I would say about the beginning so far. Watching the rest. Here we go. So screen share. Just a second. Here we go. Autological regress, which is actually the image of the theory, though I haven't described why. Physics, mind, and I guess I'll let it regress while it plays, just because that's really
to attempt to reverse engineer a miracle. When working on my science fiction novels, I attempted to do just that. My Alara series was an attempt to merge science fiction and fantasy in a believable way. But for that, I needed a scientific facsimile of magic. I could have opted for Arthur C. Clarke's sufficiently advanced technology. Recent discoveries in quantum gravity show that the fabric of space-time emerges from quantum information lying outside of physical reality. Thus, the idea came to mind that one could use this to hack physical reality much in the way that one could use cheat codes in a computer game. Thus, the formula for my fake science fiction magic was simple. Information changing reality, which is also information. This, of course, looks like magic, with cheat codes substituted for spells. But could it plausibly be thought of as real magic?
Yes. Yes, I have to stop.
Real.
All right, check it out. I didn't know anything about this video. And it seems that Johannan is absolutely right so far, with the one caveat. Hang on, let me switch it up. The one caveat that I wouldn't call it a cheat code, because it would really be removing an obstructing code from the normal program. Magic is actually a function of a metaphysical axiom, which is also a law of logic when you look at it, though it hasn't been recognized by logicians yet, and it is provable, that whatever is consistent, as in does not logically exclude, is not a contradiction to, whatever is consistent with the facts as they stand, let's say the facts as they stand is represented by, this set in a Venn diagram, whatever is consistent with that, whatever is not a self-contradiction or a contradiction logically of what is in that set, that is itself factual. In other words, whatever is not logically excluded by the facts as they stand itself factually obtains. That is actually the correct principle of sufficient reason. It's the total inverse of anything that we're now thinking. However, it's a provable conclusion, provable in two lines. The two lines being, the first one being a matter of a definitional truth, pretty much non-controversial premise, and being the logical contrapositive of the first, basically the equivalent of the conditional stated in the first premise, just flipped to its logical equivalent, equal opposite, and just nobody ever checked. Nobody ever checked to see what that conditional looked like when you took the contrapositive, and when you check to see what it looks like, it undoes the entire edifice of analytic philosophy at the root, for reasons that I can explain if it's important to your cause. but reasons that are pretty decisive. Namely, there's no such thing as a single proposition that isn't convertibly logically equivalent to all the other truth. So any one true proposition implies all the rest, and all the rest imply that, which makes it so that there's only one possible world. It's the only one that can coherently hang together with the facts. All the others are self-contradictory. False proposition is in fact logically equivalent to a self-contradiction. It's logically equivalent to both itself and its own negation. And that theorem itself is provable on the truth tables as we now know it in ordinary logic. However, it is totally at odds with everything every logician I've ever heard of, or possibly there ever has been, has thought so far. Namely, we thought that there could be false propositions that were not self-contradictory, that were not logically impossible. But it's not the case that. So there's a lot of shit under the tablecloth here. Am I supposed to play the video again?
Yeah, I mean, I've discussed this kind of thing with you a bunch of times. For some reason, I just don't feel like doing it right now.
Yeah, it's just good enough. I mean, we can come back. I think there's a lot.
Keep watching the video.
This is about as dense as
and, I mean,
it
like,
gets.
If anyone,
so far.
Yeah, if anyone is watching this, like, I would, you know, in the future, I would encourage you to.
They're gonna be like, you know,
try and figure out, you know, if you can find an objection to Mia, because like I've long had like this kind of intuition that there has to be some kind of problem with it. So, you know, there is or there isn't, and you know, I want to find out. So, and like the more people who try to find a problem, the
I mean, it's been sitting there for 3 years. Yeah. So I sympathize with you because, and for our audience's sake, MEA, MEA, the abbreviation for the mirroring entailments argument, as I called it, is that two-step proof for the principle of sufficient reason that's right, that inverts causality as we know it, and also is the logical structure that when leveraged, and there is a way to leverage it in real life, when you leverage it, it results in what would be called the real magic, namely the coherence and correspondence between a coherent interiority. And why is that? Because whatever is coherent with the facts as they stand, say my interiority, is itself factual. So supposing I have what we'd call a coherent interior epistemic relational metaphysical interpersonal stance or mode, that coherent mode, well, that mode, which is coherent and real, is what it coheres with everything else that is coherent and real, necessarily, logically necessarily. And that also entails that what that intentionality says propositionally coheres with what is propositionally describable in terms of extensionality. In other words, what you say happens. And it happens not as a matter of hocus pocus, but as a function of logical law and the metaphysical implications thereof. And it's also the false practice of magic, which is condemned by God and the Catholic Church and all well-meaning people everywhere, really, once they know about it. The difference is, on this, yes, everything you say is true. And by the way,
just because the practice is condemned doesn't mean that it isn't, like, real. I mean, it can be immoral to do, and still possible.
No, you're right. It's condemned in the sense of you're fucking up, like in the sense of like you're lighting your own shirt on fire. If you're doing this, it's not going to help you or anybody else. That's why it's gonna.
Magic works. There's just too
well, it's too much effort, and it also has a consequence where, you know, you're going to pay on the back end. And we can explain later, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, and what I imagine Johanna is talking about with real magic dash miracles, is from what I'm talking about here, when you say something in the right relational frame, coherent in itself, and therefore can't be anything but a reflection of the truth, you can actually only say one thing, logically possibly, intentionality possibly, you know, in terms of like unified will that is not a self-negating act of will. You can only say one possible thing at any given moment. Otherwise, you break the mode. But the things that you happen to be able to say are really good to say. And you are continually saying things that are true, that you don't know anything about, and you're not trying to say things that are such that you don't know anything about them. You just may happen to be saying something about something else that you think is simple, and somebody else in the room is having their heart read. That's how it goes. And that's just one of the numerous totally fantastical but verifiable implications of this, you know, new logic, which is provable from the old logic, and leverage such that physics as we know it, well, it's not falsified, but I dare suspect it's completed. And this is not just my say-so, though I'm saying so, but there are other witnesses to the empirical reality of this. This is not a special power of mine. This is a fact of the way reality works, and anybody can do it because it's the normal mode of things. It's just been obscured by various errors of form in relationships. And those errors of form have consequences that mirror themselves, and that's why we don't see what we would and say what we could if we did it differently. And if you do it differently, people think you're fucking crazy because it's different, and it's very different, but not such as to negate. So,
Okay.
you know,
I
drivel.
think we can keep going.
Okay, cool. I'm actually going to stop here. I'm going to step outside for a smoke and a drink, and we'll do a second one if you want. Agreed? Good stopping point. The woman says yes.
Okay. Okay.
And so you're
It'll start fresh when
it'll actually be better this way.
starts.
I promise I'm not going to, you know, go away for a long time now. This time at least.